Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. In this video, I'll be discussing book 26 in the classic Hardy Boys series, The Phantom Freighter, in both its original text and its revised text version. Now, the original text is a bit hard to describe in terms of the authorship because it is the last book in the series to have any input or at least be partially written by the series creator and primary writer Leslie McFarlane, who was the first ghostwriter and established most of the series' DNA, who then came back to the series with books 22 through 24 and then didn't write book 25, The Secret Panel, and then came back for this one, which marked the last Hardy Boys book he would work on. But it's actually usually credited to his wife, Amy McFarlane. So it's debated within the fan community if she finished it for him, or they co-wrote it, or it was credited to her for some reason. But it has all the hallmarks of McFarlane's style, his sense of humor, and it is in keeping with the past few books that he had written. But even more than those, it's showing, I think, more of the edicts of where the books were going. As I discussed in my last video, when you read the original text of The Secret Panel, book 25, it feels like the first of the style of what would become set in stone with the revised texts. And to explain for those who aren't aware of the revision process, the books were, of course, published by the Stratemeyer Syndicate, who would come up with the outlines and then hire various ghostwriters to write the books for the Hardy Boys series, but also for Nancy Drew and other book series. Starting in 1959, it was deemed that the 38 books that were then out were not in keeping with modern times, and so they wanted to update them. Ostensibly, this was to remove anything that really locked the earlier books in particular to the 1920s and 30s, as the series started in 1927 with the original text of The Tower Treasure. It also meant they could remove any instances of racial stereotyping which crept into some of the earlier books, but it was never a major concern. It's really only 2 books in the original text that have this as a major concern because the actual villains and cast of characters deal with more racial stereotypes. So that would be Footprints Under the Window and most of all the original text of the Hidden Harbor mystery. But those you can understand for the times in which they were written. It's nothing you wouldn't encounter in, say, a pulp magazine of the time period. But when you hear about the revision process, that's usually what you read, and you think, oh, well, that was at least something good that they did. But it was also a means of quietly streamlining and shortening the books to make them cheaper to manufacture and make them of a uniform size with the books that were then being written in 1959 onwards, and bring all of the pre-existing books into the new standards. And there was basically an unofficial set of rules where any bit of the boys having just even just a tinge of an anti-authority streak, or being a little bit rebellious, or having the extra page count to have world building and a greater sense of humor and richer texture to the stories being told, all that went out the window. And so the books were streamlined to be more of a consistent page count of anywhere between 165 to 180 or so pages, from the original text almost always being about 200 to 215 pages or so. And then they did this over an extended period of time with a different series of authors and did them out of order. They did not tell anyone of this. The only way you'd know is to have picked up the same book you had already read as a kid, but the cover was different and it was an older edition, and all of a sudden the book seemed different, or in some cases was completely different, because the level of the revisions varied wildly. Some books remained almost exactly the same. They were just basically streamlined and had some terms modernized so they didn't seem stuck in an earlier time period. Other books had additional subplots added, or had the original plot turned into a subplot. Some books were changed so dramatically that they only barely echo the original. And then some books were completely different, and the only way you would recognize any elements of the original would be if you read the text back to back, like I'm doing in this series, and then you could draw parallels in terms of trying to find like the tiniest echo, or a character name was reused. You would have to search for those. But they would basically change whatever they felt like and just have enough to be able to keep the same title. So So to study the revisions, you really do have to read the books back to back. And here in The Phantom Freighter, it is the last book to have any involvement from the series' original writer. And so this really marks, I think, the turning point with the original canon books. It started with book 25 being, in its original text, feeling like the first revised text Hardy Boys story. And then this book, it at least has more of McFarlane's flavor in the story, but I think you can already tell it's being dialed down or reduced compared to one of his earlier books. And of course, it's book 26 and it's coming out in 1947, and obviously the writer won't have the same spark that he did all the way back in 1927 with the first book. But from this point onward, you no longer have the voice of the original writer whatsoever, and he does not return to the series, so it is a definite turning point. The plot of The Phantom Freighter finds our teenage detectives, Frank and Joe Hardy, brought into a variety of small mysteries that, as is typical with the series, will somehow interconnect with one another. One mystery is the strange, eccentric individual Thaddeus McClintock, who requests the boys' assistance and promises a potential mystery, but essentially just wants to be able to take a vacation and do something he hasn't before, but he doesn't like anything. So he is a complete eccentric oddball character, much in keeping with the McFarlane original textbooks in the past. And so the boys eventually hit upon taking him on a freighter for a freighter voyage. This sets up the nautical and sailing theme that will run through the book. And of course, a book called The Phantom Freighter, you obviously know, will have scenes set at sea. The other mystery thread is that Aunt Gertrude, the boys' legendary, ultra-cantankerous, opinionated aunt, who could be a bit of a terror in the original text, loses a valuable packing case, or I should say the wrong packing case is delivered, and her case was filled with valuable family heirlooms and pictures and documents and things. When the boys try to track this down, they realize that it is somehow tied into illegal smuggling activities where various people show up at addresses where they know the houses are not going to be occupied for that time and sign for packages which contain something, because when the boys actually find these packages, all that's in there is it's an empty case with just some leftover wool in there. And this seems to perhaps tie into the activities of a smuggling gang known to be operating, and that they are using essentially legitimate shipping practices and these packing cases to actually transport smuggled goods legally, and then appear at a house where they know people are out of town for a while and sign for it pretending to be these individuals. And so they're using a legitimate means of shipping to move their smuggled goods around. This starts to dovetail with the case that their father, world-renowned private investigator Fenton Hardy, is working on. In particular, he's trying to nail a gang who's been flooding the market with forged documents, particularly historical documents. They are apparently able to do an incredible job at aging paper and all sorts of documents, but they just have a few small little slip-ups that are essentially tells. And it seems they might also be the ones using the shipping company to move smuggled goods around. So this is where the Hardy Boys case will actually meet up with their father's case and actually be the same case, as is the classic conceit of the Hardy Boys canon stories. We do have some great comic relief from the boys' number one chum, Chet Morton, who in this book has the hobby of trying to essentially create his own fishing lures, because he has to make them to get enough money to pay his father back for spending his father's money on a fancy bamboo fishing rod that nobody asked for or needed. So there's plenty of fun comic relief with Chet and his hobby that this time is born out of his own need for cash, and the boys assist him on and off with this, and it provides some nice humor throughout the book. We also have appearances by the boys' other main friends, Tony Prito and especially Biff Hooper, and the boys continually are thwarted trying to get steamship tickets because for some reason or another, the primary freighter is very standoffish towards having any passengers, and the local shipping agency is pretty much hell-bent on not allowing the boys to book passage on any freighter, and it becomes quite apparent that these forces and individuals don't want the Hardy Boys to set sail on a freighter for some unknown reason. there are plenty of action set pieces and bits where the boys are followed or have some near-death moments throughout in terms of chasing individuals and trying to get to the bottom of these various mystery threads. And eventually we do actually get our characters on a voyage with Thaddeus McClintock, doing some deep sea fishing even, with a nice, essentially old salty sea dog captain. And then this is where we run into the Phantom Freighter of the title. So it actually takes quite a while into the book, I'd say actually most of the book, before we get to the story of there essentially being a strange ship that seems to appear and disappear and not be registered anywhere. And then lo and behold, at night, they do actually see this Phantom Freighter, and it disappears by the next morning, and the boys find themselves, along with everyone else, marooned on their ship, which has mysteriously run out of gas, and so they realize their ship has been sabotaged and have to wait for the Coast Guard to rescue them. That is the basic plot setup for all the mystery threads, and then introducing the Phantom Freighter, and then the final act has the boys and everyone involved be able to actually put two and two together that obviously this Phantom Freighter has something to do with a gang of smugglers, and after some more action set pieces and even Frank getting kidnapped, the boys are actually able to trace the ship and actually board it where it looks like it's just floating derelict, but the ship actually is filled with, they're smugglers, but they kind of act more like pirates. So it's basically like a pirate smuggling gang under the leadership of the main villain referred to as Crowfeet. And then the boys have to try and escape their predicament, as not only are they thrown in the brig and have to assume the duties of members of a pirate crew, but the ship has the ability apparently to repel other ships with some sort of strange device, so they cannot be followed by any sort of ship. Now, the revised text was released in 1970. It's credited to Priscilla Baker Carr in terms of who ghost wrote it, and it is one of the most direct adaptations of an original text yet in terms of comparing the books, because the revised text is essentially, I would say, 99% identical to the original text. It's just shortened and streamlined. So the bits of world building I like to talk about in the original text, especially with the McFarlane written stories, the undercurrent of humor, any instance of the boys having to be a bit more two-fisted and thinking on their feet and having to even challenge authority figures, in particular the police, when they are a bit more bumbling or uncaring, or essentially in the revised text, the Hardy Boys always act more like deputized junior agents of the law, and they're on a first name basis with the police chief, and that is something you only have in the revised text. So the revised text is essentially the exact same story. You will very much get deja vu if you read the books back to back, but you can definitely tell from the get-go that the pacing has increased, and because a lot of the description and world building and humor and atmosphere has been stripped out, the plot moves more quickly and there's a greater sense of urgency, which is what you always get in the revised text. So it's exactly the same book. I mean, it doesn't even change some of the dialogue. It is beat for beat exactly the same, just sped up a lot and with a significantly shorter page count. The only major difference happens at the very end of the book. It's actually quite bizarre because the book has been exactly the same as the original text until the very end. So I think what it was is maybe somebody must have thought that the ending of the book didn't quite have enough punch to it in the original text. And so instead of the boys essentially deciding to just play along with the pirate smugglers and just pretend to join the crew and look for any means of escape, even when it looks hopeless, they add an extra action beat in the revised text where when the boys are in the brig, Joe Hardy manages to climb into a ventilation shaft and climb through the ventilation shaft from their little prison cell and then come out into a little control room area and then basically karate chop and knock out one of the guards to then speak with the scientist and set stuff in motion and then sneak back into the prison cell. So when you read that sequence, and this being released in the late 60s, early 70s, it very much feels as if somebody had watched Dr. No or gone to a reissue screening of Dr. No, because it very much feels like the scene where Bond breaks out of his prison cell and climbs through the ventilation shaft and takes out a guard. Same sort of setup. I mean, it's a classical pulp trope anyway, but that's what it feels like. And that little piece of action is really the only major difference between the original text and the revised text. And it comes out of nowhere. You don't expect it, because when you read the original text and then you read the revised text and you get to the very end and nothing has been really all that different, then you get to that and you're like, wait, what? But then it goes right back to the exact same conclusion as the original text, just again with a much greater sense of urgency, much faster pace, but at the cost of detail. The only other major differences with the revised text is that there is mention of Fenton Hardy's operative Sam Radley in the revised text, and again, the slight dash of anti-authority streak the boys have in the original text, especially when dealing with Officer Con Riley, who was used as more of a sort of bumbling, gruff police officer, comic relief figure in the original text, where he does have an appearance. He appears here, and he's very much a upstanding police officer. He's not a comic relief figure at all. But the actual scene is exactly the same. They basically just took out any of the jokes at the officer's expense in the original text, where the boys are able to once again show him up with their knowledge of detective work. So when you read these books back to back, you'll tell that very obviously it is exactly the same, and you can actually start to pick up on the actual lines and words that are removed when the other text on the page is actually retained almost word for word throughout. So you can very much see how the book was streamlined in order to get the page count down, make it move faster, make it focus a bit more on action, and then at the very end, tweaking it just a little bit to try and make it more of a modern experience for a kid reading it in the late 60s, early 70s. It doesn't do anything with the inherent quirks of the original text, such as why would adults think it was good for their kids to be just going off to sea with some random eccentric guy who just wanted them to figure out a vacation for him to take because he was bored, and then dangling some sort of mystery he might give them, but never exactly does. And then the mystery is basically solved at the end when there is a character who we run into practically coincidentally on the pirate ship, who just so happens to be linked to Thaddeus McClintock, and then they just sort of re-encounter one another at the end. It's very sort of tacked on and coincidental, and I don't really think it was necessary, and that is replicated in the revised text. So any quirks of the original text are there in the revised text, and one bit I noticed that was kind of interesting to note about trying to update and modernize the books and the revisions. There is a scene in the original text that takes place in a haberdashery, and that scene is still there in the revised text, and it's still a haberdashery. And you would think by 1970 they might, change the location or just change the type of store it was or something, because at that point in 1970, I don't think haberdasheries were in vogue as much, or they would be called something else. It was kind of funny reading these back to back. That was the one thing that jumped out at me as being very much more a part of the original text as opposed to a book that was supposed to be up to date in 1970. It's also interesting that the ship of the title, the Phantom Freighter, does not appear in the book or even get referenced until significantly into the book. And while we finally do get to have our characters board it and the finale is set on it, it doesn't really feel like a big part of the story because it comes into the book so late, and then right after it's mentioned, we actually do encounter it and then don't encounter it again for a while. I think it would have been much more effective to at least introduce the Phantom Freighter, or maybe have the boys run into what they think is a ship at the very start of the book. Like they could be out in the Sleuth, their fantastic motorboat, and have heard the story and then have some sort of run-in, but everybody thinks they're nuts, or they don't say anything because they obviously can't talk about what is seemingly a ghost ship that nobody knows about. So I think it should have just been at least introduced earlier to be at least a little bit more effective, because you pick up this book expecting a sort of phantom ghost ship, and it's not even mentioned until significantly into the book, and then all of a sudden it's there and it's gone, and then it doesn't reappear until we get close to the end. Overall, I do think The Phantom Freighter is an effective book. I do think it is better than The Secret Panel because it has McFarlane's involvement. You feel his style in there, whether he wrote most of it and his wife finished it, or whether she wrote it with his input. However it was actually written, you can feel his stamp on it. And with it being his last involvement with the Hardy Boys series, that makes this book truly important. And so this is the point at which you now move into a whole series of other writers for the original text up to book 38. And then from book 39 onwards, we're completely in the world of the revised text. But the original text from The Secret Panel onwards, with the exception of Phantom Freighter, are already significantly close to the revised text style, and they will just continue to get closer and closer to that until you hit 1959. Now, in terms of determining which text is better, in this case, it's the original text, because the revised one is exactly the same book, except not as detailed, not as funny, not as interesting, really, because a lot of the life and vitality has been stripped out. It's good on its own, and it's going to be the version most people nowadays grew up reading because it's been in circulation longer. But when I was growing up, I actually had my original text copy. I didn't quite realize it when I first got it as a kid, but it was the version that I read first and what I was used to. And then when I got the revised text version, it felt the same, but a little bit different. And then as I got older and I started learning about the revision process, it started making sense why some books suddenly felt different and why some were significantly shorter in other versions. And it wasn't just changing the cover artwork. So this is one of the cases where I actually had the original text first, and it was the one that I read growing up. So the revised text is a bit less familiar to me, but it is exactly the same book. So you really can't compare them outside of just looking for what was removed or streamlined. And really the only major change is adding the slight action beat towards the end with the ventilation shaft. So outside of that, they're the same book, and the revised text is not as engaging as the original. So the original is the better book without question, because outside of that tweak to the ending, they are the same, and the revised text is not as good. Now, in terms of the cover artworks, there are only two for the Phantom Freighter. The first is from the original edition and all editions of the original text. This is by the artist Russell Tandy, who is doing the art at this time, and features the great scene where the boys come across the Phantom Freighter seemingly adrift at night on the sea, and they get on a little rowboat to go over with a crewman from the freighter they're on. And you've got a wonderful sense of ominous foreboding with the nighttime setting. You've got the freighter in the background with the searchlight, and you've got the boys approaching the side of the ship where they're going to try and climb on board and see if anything's on there, because it looks totally abandoned. And you have that wonderful sense of it's almost like a ghost ship, because it's just floating in the middle of the sea at night, and they have to put a spotlight on it, and they can't see any sign of movement or life on board. So it's a really great moment, and I think it is well captured here. I think the artwork is really nice, and you even have some sort of choppiness to the water. So it's got all the right notes to visually recreate the scene. The boys are rather small in the bottom of the cover, but that's of course how they would be, trying to board the ship and being on this little rowboat. And in order to have the ships sort of larger in the image, they of course have to be a bit smaller and down here in the bottom. So in terms of composition, I think this is really good. I love what they did with this cover, and it beautifully recreates the scene from the book. And it's actually got the Phantom Freighter of the title on the actual cover, which is really what you always want in a Hardy Boys cover. We have the title in white and then the Hardy Boys logo in red across the top, which is in keeping with the style of the books at this point in terms of the cover layout. And then the standard house name credit for Franklin W. Dixon just sort of stamped on the bottom. So I really do think this is a nice cover, and I think it's one of the artist Tandy's best for the series. The revised text got the new cover artwork by the most legendary series artist, Rudy Nappi, and this is in his style of this point in time in the late 60s, early 70s. We have a sort of surreal tinge to it, with there being a bold background color, and then our lead characters along with some singular object or the title object are in various sizes. And this one is probably his most abstract for his Hardy Boys covers, because we have Frank and Joe basically being menaced by what seems to be the figure of the Phantom Freighter coming out of what would be the shadows, except everything is yellow. So instead of it having any sort of blue to suggest water, it almost looks like it's the yellow of being in a searchlight or a spotlight, and the boys are sort of caught in it and they look kind of spooked, and then you can see the outlines of a freighter behind them sort of coming through, basically sort of being revealed by this spotlight. I think it's really striking. It's certainly eye-catching to get something this bold and yellow like this, but it does rub some fans the wrong way, and I've seen a lot of people debate this. I know a lot of people think it's a terrible cover. I think it is actually conveying what the story is about, but it is a bit abstract, and it's just me thinking about this cover for ages and wondering why is it yellow, that I finally realized, well, maybe it's supposed to be the searchlight revealing the Phantom Freighter, and it's like the outlines of the ship are being revealed and the Hardy Boys themselves are sort of caught in the middle of the beam. I do like that Frank and Joe have really nice renderings and they look scared. That's how it should be, and that does give the cover the ominous flavor that it needs, but the rest of it is so abstract that it is one of those covers where I know some people really don't like it, and so its overall effectiveness is a bit mixed because you kind of have to look at it for a minute and try to figure out what it is, and it takes a second to realize that it's actually a ship in the background. We have the title on the top in black with the lines breaking up, the Hardy Boys credit, and then the Franklin W. Dixon house name. This is in the style of the books at this time, and of course would eventually be updated by adding the number on the front cover on later printings. Now, in terms of editions in my own collection, I just have two. My childhood copy is actually my original text copy, so this is a picture cover edition with the original Tandy artwork, with really nice printing. It always varied and still does to this day, even on modern reprints, in terms of how well the artwork is reproduced or cropped. As you can see, there is really nice, nuanced, and bold color, which was well reproduced on this picture cover printing. So it looks even better when you actually see it on a book in your hands, as opposed to just seeing an image online. And of course, we have the classic blue spine, and with the earlier font in terms of what's used for the number on the spine and all the text on the rear. And that's always an indicator that you've got an earlier picture cover printing, at least predating the 1970s later ones where they switched to Helvetica. The way you can always try and date your copy is, of course, look at the book list on the back, and this goes to Mystery of the Desert Giant, which came out in 1961, so that should date this to about 1961. Inside we have the classic brown and white in papers, and then we have the title page with the front piece artwork. Here's the original 1947 copyright date. And then the other dead giveaway that you've got in an original text is that there are typically more chapters, and you can see it goes well over 200 pages. And then you have the layout and font. And as you can see, this is already the traditional, well-known style of the revised text, which actually started with the previous original text on Book 25, The Secret Panel. So really the last original text to have the classic original text layout and font is actually book 24, The Shortwave Mystery. And my copy of the revised text with the nappy artwork is actually the flashlight edition. This is what the books were switched over to in the 1990s and are still printed in this edition to this day. So this has the revised text artwork, and the reproduction is quite good. They can really vary on the flashlight editions, just like the picture covers. So you always have to worry about, is the image cropped right? Is it cropped too much? Is the color washed out? Because they can really vary. But this one is done very well and retains the nice bold color usage. The flashlights all have the same standardized spines, and then they have the identical rear cover with blurb. We have the new title page with front piece artwork, and then the new copyright page, and you can always tell it's a revised text because you see multiple dates. And then the earliest date will always be the original publication copyright date of the original text, which is why that shows 1947. This is a printing from the year 2000, and the reason why I mention that is even though you can still get these in print today, if you get flashlight editions from after 2005, they usually don't have the same print quality. They feel just a little bit flimsy. The artwork isn't reproduced as well. So if you're looking at used copies or you're trying to get flashlights, typically these from around 1999 to the early 2000s, basically anything pre-2005, they're typically a little bit better made. The artwork's done better, and they just feel a bit more solid. And of course, you can also tell it's a revised text because the last chapter starts on page 170. So that's an indication right there that you've lost quite a number of pages. And then here is the text block for the revised text, and you can see it's almost exactly the same opening page text as the original version. Of course, the revised text did add the iconic internal illustrations. So in The Phantom Freighter, you do have some of the scenes illustrated. So here is where the boys stumble across the burning barn from the opening that happens to contain a packing case they believe to be their aunt's missing package. Here's a nice illustration of one of the great comic bits of the book where the boys are first trying to help Ched Morton in his scheme to make money by making fishing lures, and Joe sits on a fishhook. Thankfully, they did illustrate one of the key set pieces of the book where the boys are trailing someone and he seemingly gets away, but they realize that he's actually hidden inside the shop window of the shop they chased him into. And so the boys try to lock him in there, only to have the guy actually stop pretending to be a dummy and jump through the plate glass window, and then a short chase ensues. Here the boys examine a carton they think is going to be their aunt's, and here the boys realize they're being shadowed. I have to say that the illustrations in this book, outside of actually showing the guy jumping out the window and the funny bit of Joe sitting on a fishhook, they chose some of the most basic moments to illustrate, and then the illustrations are rather plain. And you would think that in The Phantom Freighter, they might, actually illustrate the Phantom Ghost ship itself. They don't. So, the revised texts always have a handful of illustrations, and that is all of them in this book. So, unfortunately, most of the big showpiece moments don't get illustrated. They did at least get one with the dummy who isn't actually a dummy jumping out the store window, but all the rest are just rather basic. So sometimes I wonder why they chose certain scenes, or maybe they just chose a page at random. But I always felt it weird that the Phantom Freighter doesn't have an illustration of the Phantom ship itself. It's just the front piece artwork of the captain pointing out the ship seemingly coming out of the darkness, but there's nothing for the action climax either. So that's just a particular quirk of the revised text of Book 26. So those are my thoughts on Book 26 in the classic Hardy Boys series, The Phantom Freighter, in both its original 1947 text and its 1970 revised text. I think the book is really important for being the last to ever have any sort of involvement from original writer Leslie McFarlane, and even if you didn't know who wrote it, just reading the original text and having read read his earlier books in the series, you would immediately recognize that classic flavor of the original Hardy Boys series was there in book 26. So that is immediate just from page 1. But as I said, you can detect that it's only coming in spurts, and it's as if the decisions being made have been changed, and so the edicts have been changed for what the ghostwriters were supposed to do. And of course, I'm sure the outline process was a bit different by that point in the 1940s. So with the secret panel before it being really the start of the revised text style, I think the Phantom Freighter is probably the last sort of flourish of the original text feel, because it's the last to have any involvement from the original writer. So I think from this point onwards, it's very much just going to be continually inching closer to being completely in the revised text realm. The revised text version is still good and a classic, especially for those who grew up on it, but when you get the chance to compare the two, it is immediately obvious that the revised text is, it's basically a watered down, quicker version of the original. It is identical in places in terms of it being word for word identical, but then you can compare paragraphs and see how sentences were shortened, how all sorts of world building was dialed down or frankly removed. So you lose such a great deal of flavor, even though that was already diminished in the original compared to what McFarlane did in the early books in the series. So you can see how the series is changing already at this point, and you can see how it's also changed and reflected in the revised text version. But when you compare the two books, the original is the far better reading option because it's essentially the uncut version, if you will, compared to the revised text essentially being the edited for time and clarity version. So as always, I hope my babblings about the classic Hardy Boys series have been at least somewhat fun and informative. If you've been able to read both texts of the Phantom Freighter, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. But until I return in my next video on Book 27, The Secret of Skull Mountain, I just want to say, as always, please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to pick up some lovely editions for your own collection. Keep reading the classic Hardy Boys series, keep reading print books, and thank you ever so much for watching.